kind of order of speaking order, right? Is that right?
I'll just stand straight over to you, basically. So I'll just do a very brief.
Okay. I'm not blocking you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the first event of our Cambridge Festival series at the Cambridge Union. We're really pleased to have you here today. I'm going to pass you straight over to John, who's going to be chairing the event, and hope you enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, folks. Thank you for coming. This is a good time to be talking about this subject, as you may have guessed, because across the democratic world there are an awful lot of elections this year. And some of them may well have very important outcomes. For example, if in November the United States electorate makes the wrong decision, then can I suggest you book your tickets for Mars? We have an election this year. There's an important election in Ireland and in all kinds of other places. So this is an important year in the democratic world. And the thing about democracies, even though they are an endangered species at the moment, is that elections take place inside a public sphere, inside what you might call our information ecosystem. And the thing about that ecosystem is that it has, in our lifetimes, I think, for most people here, it has undergone a radical change. We've gone from an ecosystem that was dominated by broadcast television and print media to an ecosystem that is dominated one way or another by the internet. And more importantly, by the things that run on the internet, like the web and social media. And since 2015, we have realized that there is, in some way, these different technologies, these social media, have some impact on elections. It's not clear exactly what the impacts are, and also there's no conclusive proof that anybody votes in a certain way because of what they experienced from media of any kinds. But nevertheless, there's definitely something going on, and so on. And the thing that makes this conversation tonight absolutely timely is that in the last kind of few months, there's a new beast in the jungle. It's called machine learning, but it's been rebranded by the tech industry as, quote, AI, as if it had something to do with intelligence. But that's right. And if you want to think about it, it is a way in which machines can generate plausible communications, either in language or perhaps in graphics. And what that means is that there's a possibility that these machines could also do plausible kinds of propaganda, and that may have an impact on the democratic process. You could think of them, if you want to, as social media on steroids. That might be what we might be confronting this year during these electoral processes. And this might be important. It might not be as important as many of us fear, or it might be more important than some of us think. But just to give you an illustration of the effect of this sort of how persuasive these machine-generated dialogues could be, here's a story two of us heard recently from somebody who's a big shot in the AI world, and who had, with some of his mates, arranged. They were slightly worried that when you rang Downing Street and you wanted to talk to people about AI, there was nobody in the Downing Street that appeared to have any interest in it. So they arranged a briefing for the Prime Minister. And they did the standard thing. They put together a good professional presentation kind of stuff with PowerPoint slides and the rest of it. And this was watched and listened to politely by those in attendance. But they're shrewd buggers, these fellas. And they had also brought a secret with them. They'd brought a deep fake of Rishi Sunak saying things that Rishi Sunak would not normally say. And at that point, the Prime Minister woke up. But suddenly he began to, it seems, appreciate the extent of the capabilities of this technology. And of course, being a politician, he understood what those capabilities might mean. So, this stuff could be serious, which is why we have assembled here a really interesting panel. Starting with one of my fellow journalists, so to speak, who's written 4 books, I think, on this stuff.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Plenty, lots, yes.
Okay.
I've lost count, to be honest.
And then we have Ella, who's a sociologist. You know what sociology is. Bertrand Russell once said that economics is the study of how people make choices, and sociology is the study of how they don't have any choices to make.
Yeah.
And then there's Jonnie Penn, who teaches AI ethics and other things. And finally, there's Melisa, who has a social media misinformation, is it?
I'm a social psychologist. I work
Right.
on misinformation.
Excuse me,
Okay.
a lot of us here have real difficulty hearing. Because
Really?
Really?
Right. Well, in my case, that might be an advantage. Okay, but we should talk more loudly.
Oh, interesting.
Right.
shall we introduce ourselves?
Yes. Do.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. So I'm hoping this is working. Is it working?
I think so. Yeah.
Oh, some of you can hear me, some of you can't hear me, so I will move the microphone up as well. So my name is Chris Stokel-Walker. I'm a journalist. Thank you. I get a round of applause. Fantastic. Knew the Cambridge Union was very welcoming. So my name is Chris Stokel-Walker. I'm a journalist and an author. I am fascinated and intrigued about what's going to come next, and like John, I don't have any answers, and I'm going to rely hopefully on the experts to kind of give us some. But I'm torn between wanting to hype this up and saying that this is alarming and something we should pay attention to, while also with a book that I'm publishing on AI later this year in May, looking at the kind of long run and history of artificial intelligence, or whatever you want to call it, because it's not intelligent, and thinking a little bit more realistically about how we've heard this sort of thing before. So yes, I'm intrigued as to kind of what's going to happen, and looking forward with a little bit of trepidation and also a little bit of a shrug of the shoulders, I suppose.
Good. Yeah, I'm Ella McPherson. I'm a sociologist here at Cambridge. I think you can hear me because I see people nodding. Yeah, good, good. I'm a sociologist of new media and digital technology, and I've spent a lot of time, many years, looking at digital fakery in the human rights space, where human rights fact finders back in 2012 were saying there's this fake news thing that's showing up when we look at digital evidence, and everyone, kind of to the point of your story before, was saying, what are you talking about? And then they knew exactly what they were talking about. So I looked at that for a long time, and I now have a newer project looking at neo-Luddites, so people who are resisting technology, breaking technology, refusing technology, etc.
Johnny?
Hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Dr. Jonnie Penn. I teach a course here on the ethics of artificial intelligence. I'm a historian of technology and a historian of AI in particular. And what I'm interested in is that because of kind of folk accounts of where AI and machine learning came from, we often think of figures like, Alan Turing, or Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy, these kind of singular men that brought down from the mountain some active genius that we now rely on for all sorts of tools in our lives. And actually, part of what has fascinated me in the area of research that I do is that the origins of modern computing are in state and corporate administration. It takes a lot to conduct a census. It takes a lot to run an empire. And if you look at who funded the tools that we are now talking about, implementing across our lives in all sorts of different ways, the origins date back in very interesting ways to the ways you run a corporation. And so one of the things, and a state, as I've said, so one of the things I've argued in the past is that AI thinks like a corporation, and I think I take that as a kind of sign to be cautious about where we choose to use it.
Super interesting. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, wonderful. Hi everyone, I'm Melisa Basol. I'm a social psychologist. I see some frowning. So.
That's better.
Is that okay? I'll try and not exhale too loudly. I have a cough, so bear with me. I'm a social psychologist. I spent much of my time here at Cambridge while doing my PhD studying misinformation and whether it's possible to build cognitive resilience against misinformation. We've developed something called pre-bunking, or rather we've brought it back from an ancient theory on persuasion from back in the 60s and assessed in a lab environment here at the Cambridge Decision Making Research Lab whether it's possible to preemptively debunk some of the most common manipulation techniques that underpin misinformation, propaganda, and other forms of manipulation. And so I've been trying and testing that here for some considerable time, and then I've moved on to a company called Moonshot that is based in London that focuses on fighting online harms, anything sort of ranging from gender-based violence and violent extremism to mis and disinformation, and that's where I'm leading some of the projects there. And I'm really keen on being here today and discussing this topic and sort of bringing in the component of, which I think is often missing in these discussions, of the psychology of it all, where the human meets the technology and how our sometimes outdated and archaic brains may not be equipped well to deal with social media, misinformation, and now AI. So thanks for having us.
Thank you. And just following from that, do you think this stuff really makes a difference in relation to elections?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I don't know if I have a cohesive response to. But to kind of set the scene, and you were doing that at the beginning, I think, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this, but this is, after all, a monumental election year. I think I was looking at this on my train ride here, and there are over 80 national elections happening this year, affecting around 4.2 billion individuals, which is roughly 52% of the global population, right? So we have a big moment, and there was recently a survey where, by the World Economic Forum, where the experts agreed that election-specific misinformation is one of the biggest existential and societal threats. And so we know that it is a critical time where people will be hopefully going to vote and use their vote. But we also know that this collides with not only the rise of generative AI, but also maybe regulations and solutions that might not be in place and up and running fully by the time that these elections have taken place. I've had the chance to speak to experts in this sphere and sort of learn from them over the last few months, and what I found was it's not only become faster and cheaper and easier than ever before to create manipulation or misinformation. What experts seem to be most worried about was, what one coined, Cambridge Analytica on steroids, that with AI it will become incredibly easy to create highly personally tailored pieces of misinformation. And so I think it's not necessarily a question around whether AI will swing the election completely, but will it affect the movable middle, the critical few percent that sometimes do determine an election outcome? That could well be. I think personally, looking at this and sort of having reviewed some of the data over the last few weeks, again, to refresh my mind on it, it struck me that distrust seems to be one of the most common themes in society at the moment. There was a big trust survey recently done, and they found that across the sector, there's deep-rooted distrust. There's almost a level of paranoia and sort of deep state conspiracies when it comes to politics. There's this rising distrust when it comes to science. There's distrust when it comes to media and journalism. And so what one study actually found was that the mere presence of AI, knowing that any information that you encounter online could be fabricated, could be AI generated, further sows distrust. And I think that is a really difficult situation to be in, when people do not trust information anymore, when they do not trust elections anymore, when they do not trust democratic processes anymore.
I mean, it's interesting to talk about that, and I hate to bring the tone down from highfalutin elections and politics and important things to kind of the topic that everybody is discussing at the minute. But the Kate Middleton story is an aspect of that, where we have photographic evidence, we have video evidence, and because we have over the last 18 months been fed this diet from big tech companies saying this is a revolutionary technology, to Jonnie's kind of point of view of, AI is developed for companies' benefits. This is a revolutionary technology, this is something that is going to change the game. We no longer trust things. Seeing is no longer believing. And so to live in that kind of post-truth, as you've talked earlier about social media elections and how we've had that sort of thing before, and this is potentially the first AI election, but to have a kind of world in which we always have that question at the back of our mind now of, is this real or is this actually just a hyper-realistic AI-generated image or video, does have the potential to do something, I suppose, to electors. And that could be a real concern when talking about that kind of micro-targeting as well.
Before we get stuck in, could I ask a question? How many people here have played with or tried this kind of generative AI? How many people, for example, have used ChatGPT? Okay, that's really helpful and very useful. Because I was going to go back to continue this question in a way, which is, it seems to me that the difference between the social media that we think may have had an impact on the 2016 election, say, right? The difference between that and and what's capable with this new kind of technology is that this technology means that we have machines that can speak to us in convincingly human-like ways. And my conjecture is that this may mean that they are more persuasive, possibly, than what we were used to with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and so on. Do you think that's true? Possible?
You mean the audio component of it, the deepfake
it could be
audio?
but even the fact that for example, the difference between asking a question of Google, the search engine, and you get, well, mostly you get advertising now, but it doesn't matter. But the point is, you can ask a question and you get some kind of reply. But if you ask the same question of say, ChatGPT, you get a much more tailored and conversational response, which sounds to many people, or looks to many people, as if actually it's like talking to a human being about this.
Yeah.
Do you think that's naive, or?
So I see your point. I do think there's an area of concern there. But I think in a way, if we focus on that particular cause and effect thing with generative AI, we're missing a bigger point that people aren't talking about that I want to talk about here.
Okay.
Just, if that's okay.
Do talk.
Okay. Which is that I think, we are all asking these kinds of questions about like our neighbors, like our fellow citizens who are going to go to vote. And I think most of us don't think that's going to happen to us, and also that we don't really think we ourselves are dupable, right? We think other people are dupable. And what I'm worried about with this technology is that there's so much hype around it. We're getting sort of distracted by the hype, and we're being distracted from being good citizens, we're being distracted from being good community members, etc. We are spending so much time trying to either figure out the tech by playing with it, or ask ourselves questions like this about our neighbors, or I don't even know, sort of worry about how it's coming into like our work, and like our academic work is definitely, we're talking about it nonstop in terms of, is this essay an essay or is this a ChatGPT essay, right? It just makes me really worried that it's distracting us from what we want to do, who we want to be, the politics we want to exercise. And so I think one of the big consequences is this mistrust problem. That's a really big problem. So that's not about being tricked by it, but rather about what we think of our neighbors and our institutions. I think another one is actually really basic, which is about our time, right? What do you spend your time doing? How much agency do you have in terms of, what you put your energies into? And I just feel personally, but also my research subjects, I spend more and more of my week figuring out technology, whether it's like some big disruption like ChatGPT, or it's like a system update that I wasn't expecting, or it's, tech infrastructure comes and he wants to put a 5G tower in my neighborhood and nobody wants it in the park or whatever. It's taking over my life. And I want us to talk about that, and I want us to take that time back, because I think so it's sort of saying this panel, it's wonderful while we're here, it's great we're discussing this, but also what does it mean that we're doing this and not, going into a community meeting or, I don't know, sort of spending time with our families. Maybe we are like this, a community meeting anyway, but I want us to talk about the consequences of what we perceive to be the consequences, if that makes sense. So what do we do in reaction to this threat that we see, a threat that is not fully yet established?
So what do we do?
Well, I think we resist. I think I was thinking about this, the fact that we're here, it's almost like a fait accompli, like we're having a panel looking on the AI's effect on elections. We're assuming that AI is a done deal, right? But that's only if we all use it and accept that it's here. We don't have to do that. I mean, this sounds kind of radical, but go Neo-Luddites, right?
Yeah.
But there's something there about technological determinism. That's what's driving this whole thing.
Can I give a point on this?
You raised that.
I have students come from OpenAI and DeepMind, and often they come to this course feeling a little bit like, I work on the front lines and this doesn't quite add up. I've been told that this is going to change the world, but why do I feel, they're smart people, they're curious people. It's not uniformly technologists, but people that feel little misgivings about where we are. One of the things we cover in the course is that, the printing press is often held up as a kind of precursor, as a historical analogy to where we are today. This is the new printing press. The people that tell that story often don't tell the part that it took 400 years to go from the printing press to mass literacy. So it is supposed to be an example of technological determinism, create the tool, and take the social benefit. What was that 400 years about, right? Mm-hmm. The difference that made a difference was a social innovation, not a technological innovation. It was the introduction of free education. The price of paper had to come down, among other things, but what I say to students is what's the better invention, the internet or the weekend? Because we forget that we have to actually formalize the routines and procedures that we agree to live within. And I can give a whole spiel. I think that in the spirit of what you were saying, Ella, we're far too reactive in this moment in trying to kind of on the back foot respond to big tech. I think we are currently inhabiting big tech's vision of life. This is it. I look at the numbers of mental illness among young people. I don't think it's a screaming success. People, there are other cultures with less technological prowess have lived happier lives, provably, according to the front page of The Guardian today, than young people today. What do we do? Among the answers, I think, in the same way that the word sustainability in the 1970s would have struck people's ears as kind of unusual. What does that mean? We're going to protect the earth. It's kind of woo-woo. I don't know what you mean. I think that decomputerization is the equivalent today. I think we've lived in an era of computational maximalism, that we have been drunk on the idea that we can just channel everything through computing. And that future generations, for climate reasons, for democratic reasons, for economic reasons, for cultural reasons, will see the tie that binds, as you pointed to, John, is that we've just kind of overestimated the capacity of these tools. And actually doing things analog, a la this session right now, I know it's being live streamed, matters. There is something that is accomplished not by doing it through that infrastructure.
I'd love to jump on that. I think you raised so many important questions, and I wish I could address each one of them, but one thing in particular around the mental health component. The WHO basically claimed that we live through a loneliness and isolation epidemic. That people are lonelier and more isolated than before coming out of COVID, and that few of us have true, meaningful friendships and connections. And to tie this to AI, I've been thinking about this recently, because I came across something called Character AI and Replica, which are basically AI-powered companions. And you can pick your favorite author, or you can pick a role to fill, and that person will engage with you and tailor its way of speaking to you, to your preferences. And before you know it, you have an ever accessible, ever supporting friend online that is there for you. And so I think actually that the loneliness component and the mental health component possibly pose one of the biggest national security threats, and that AI could be leveraged to address that and exploit that. And in its most harmless form, and what we're already seeing now, this has led to sextortion of teenagers or online fraud. In its maybe most extreme forms, it could possibly scan your behavior online and tailor its responses to you and build a friendship over months, and then one day gently nudge you to vote otherwise or to think otherwise, and push you towards a motive that you do not see, that we don't have transparency on. And so I'm really glad that we are anchoring this conversation around sort of the consequences of the consequences. And that maybe, and you were saying this earlier, this is not a new problem with AI, but that AI is just holding up a spotlight onto very human problems that are now accelerated and proliferated and are sort of unavoidable, and we have to confront them.
But before Chris chips in, as you talk, I'm remembering something that Martin Heidegger said, the philosopher. He once said somewhere that technology is the art of arranging the world so you don't have to experience it. And in a way, that's what you've been talking.
Yeah.
That's what you've been seeing.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. Sorry, Chris, I cut in on you.
Well, I was going to, on that, it's interesting, the idea of kind of manipulation, and I think that is what is capturing people's attention and getting people worried. I know I speak often to a guy called Eddie Perez, who, until Elon Musk took over Twitter, was their head of election integrity and now works for the OSET Institute, which is kind of a US non-profit looking at election integrity. And he's worried about kind of a two-track thing. So there is this kind of grand top-down, state-sponsored use of this technology, you know, in the same way that we've seen conversations being shifted in the 2016 election, as you were talking about, for the US presidential race, of kind of not bot armies, but essentially state-sponsored paid army units in comment sections convincing you to change your brand of biscuit and then to change your political persuasion. That could be supercharged potentially by AI because you can just do that at speed. But one of the other concerning things is, I suppose, the bottom-up aspect of this. We're now putting this technology in, you know, hundreds of millions of hands, and you know, the show of hands was really instructive because I, with the greatest will in the world, looking around, I don't imagine many of us are computer scientists in this room who can, you know, decode the intricacies of an algorithm or something like that. And yet we are able to use those tools to do something similar. The deepfake audio that you were talking about before, John, and we were talking about there was, you know, there was a deepfake audio of Joe Biden producing robocalls to potential voters in the US recently, which immediately people thought, oh, this is either Russia or this is, you know, the Republican Party writ large. But it was just, you know, a super PAC, a kind of small organization without much effort. And I think that is the concern, is we're putting these tools in people's hands and we haven't thought through or gamed through the consequences necessarily.
Is that not? I worry though, because I think it's easy to be condescending to people, to think that like these, you know, peasants just aren't going to be able to figure this one out. And I'm not. That's an unfair read of what you've said, maybe. But like, I grew up with the internet, and I remember like the internet grew up at the same time I grew up, and I remember, you know, the Anarchist's Cookbook was people were freaking out. It was like another satanic panic that my 14-year-old's going to learn to make dynamite because he downloads some PDF, you know, with those instructions. And I think generative AI is a part of the world, and I just wonder if there's a way where we can honor its uses. You know, I've heard it described as like you go to Google for facts, you go to ChatGPT for creative answers. So factual answers versus creative answers. That's one. But at least if you're not looking for it for factual answers, you're looking at for creative interpretations. We should debate if you disagree. But the thought I was going to put forward was just that, like, I think we need to start working with it as in addition to working against it. And the best metaphor I can think of for this is like in sheet music, you have notes and rests. They both are part of the composition. We are hot on the notes. We've developed lots of uses for these tools. What are, not in a kind of prohibition, knock it all out sort of way, but what are the areas in which we see, resist or reprieve may be more beneficial, that we may choose not to use algorithms. One example being that, like, young people are kind of voting with their feet against dating apps because dating apps suck for a lot of young people. So they're just doing what people used to do, just meet each other on the streets. But yeah.
But if you, sorry,
go ahead.
No, you go. I've talked too much.
I just want to respond to the point about creative work. Because
I meant creative answers, not creative work.
Okay. I just published a manifesto on AI and scholarship, which was getting to this. Like, can we use generative AI in scholarship and feel good about it, right? Feel good in terms of our values. For me, I came away saying, no, I definitely can. 3 reasons. One, environmental, like linking it back to your point about sustainability, the environmental costs of generative AI are extraordinary. I think we're not talking about this enough.
Yeah.
I just picked up a couple facts from reading about it, some research about it recently. If you have a normal interaction with ChatGPT, you might have 10 to 50 queries. That takes a pint of water, okay? If you ask a big generative AI model to make you an image, one image, that takes as much energy as charging your phone battery fully, right? And Word and Excel and Atlas TI and all these tools we use in creative work, they're just putting it in there, not even asking us, do you want to use it? It just shows up and it says, here's our interpretation of your data, which is often extremely wrong. But okay, there's that. Then I think there's this thing about ethics, right, and integrity. And again, speaking in the field of scholarship, we are so into academic integrity and transparency and citing each other, giving credit where credit is due. How can we use a tool whose business model is plagiarism to write academic work? We can't. The last thing is about what I've been calling the eurekas, right? So, and I think about why do I have my job? What do I like about my job? And it's actually the emotion of producing knowledge. Like, I love those eureka moments. Aha, like the data is telling me this, or ooh, I like the sentence I wrote, or whatever it is. And what these kind of sort of writing generative AI models do is kind of take away opportunities for that, because it analyzes the data for you and then it writes it for you. And all you do is check and edit. And I feel like the kind of real joys of scholarship are leached out of a system where we do that. So I'm not saying that you're saying it's good for creative work. I'm just reacting to that which is going on all around us.
Well,
right?
What I struggle with is my little brother. I have a half brother's 17, and he's using it for his science project in the way that I would have used the internet back in the day. And I don't know how to reckon with that because, I don't want to be paternalistic. The environmental piece, 100% I can see it. I think that's critical. And our version of scholarship, I think, has virtues that we should protect, including attribution. I totally agree. And the eureka piece and the kind of semantics of this. But yeah, I think as a historian, the shift that AI is is a word they were using to describe. I've called it the charismatic megafauna of a complex set of histories. In the same way that the ailing polar bear is the image of climate change. I think AI exists to communicate. The reason we're all here thinking about it in democracy is there is a lot of change in the world separate from it. So I'm not endorsing it, but I'm also stuck with thick histories that are difficult to reduce.
Okay, here's a different way of thinking about it then. When this goes back a long way, but when the Apple II came out years and years and years ago, it was conceived of as a machine that would appeal to hobbyists. People who are interested in computing. We would call them nerds in the old days and geeks now. But okay, so and when it went on sale in the US first, it was generally perceived that way. And then something happened. People, usually males, in suits, were going into the few computer stores that then existed. And a few weeks before that, Dan Bricklin and his colleague had written a program called VisiCalc. VisiCalc was the first spreadsheet program, and it was written for the Apple II, and it only ran on the Apple II. And then what happened? Well, what happened is that people running computer stores selling the Apple II were amazed to find men in suits coming in, seeing VisiCalc, and saying, I want that. And the guy, the salesperson in the store would have to say, well, you have to have a computer as well, it only runs on this thing. Okay, put that into. And Apple discovered that to their astonishment, people who were buying Apple IIs were, in many cases, had nothing to do with computing at all. There were people who'd been to business school and who'd been through, in business schools in those days, in the pre-computer days, they were all taught with spreadsheets, but the spreadsheets were on a whiteboard. And every time you changed a cell, everything else had to be recalculated by hand. And suddenly they saw this magic happening, and I thought, okay, and they got it. Okay. Now, we live in a world now which is dominated by spreadsheets, alas, but nevertheless, they are extremely useful things. And when ChatGPT first broke cover, I remember thinking, this is a bit like the spreadsheet, in the sense that it does something that people find helpful and useful, and it does it kind of automatically. And I think in relation, and there is something about that in this technology, which is one of the reasons why it is making so much noise, and so, it's so interesting to people and so on. It does some things that some people find difficult, but which suddenly make it easier. Sometimes it has all the disadvantages that you've been talking about in the sense of plagiarism and all that. But for example, if you have some long, complicated document and your job involves writing a brief summary of it, it turns out that you feed the document into one of these language models and ask for a summary of the main points in it, and generally it's quite good. And that's bloody useful.
Generally. When I asked ChatGPT to put a biography together of me, it adds those 4 books and makes it 7, and then also gives me an Oxford degree, which is very nice. But I only went to Newcastle, and I'm really stupid.
But
so.
you cannot take out your Oxford degree. You just go to the Sheldonian and you get it. Okay, no, I get that. But nevertheless, in mundane things, it's quite good.
But did you want to say something?
I don't want to talk about the quality of the output, so if you want to respond to that first.
Yes, just briefly. I think that this analogy to Excel or the calculator or the whatever is very dangerous, because I don't think it's the same thing at all.
Okay.
I see your point in terms of you might use it for the same reasons, but it's not the same thing. In that, it is, so with the calculator or Excel or whatever, we're talking about objective numbers, and no matter what you do, you're going to get the same calculation if you do the same input, right? Yeah. With ChatGPT, with generative AI, it is subjective stuff that is not intelligence, but rather binary code that is being masqueraded as objective. This is going to tell you what it says. And it doesn't, right? And I think that is all the different sort of biases that come into the data, because it all comes from sort of qualitative data, and it means that it's something actually quite different. But when people make that analogy, I think it sort of elides the danger that's there in the bias and the misinterpretation and the fake references that I've seen generate. Like it's so wrong in a way that Excel isn't wrong. So yeah, I find it different, very different.
I think there's another historical anecdote that kind of pairs with what you're saying, and it's almost the foil to that example. In the Netflix contest, they put $1 million bid out and said, anybody that can beat our algorithm will give you $1 million, right? So the group that won it improved, I think they improved their recommendation engine by like 13 or 11%, big numbers for what that is. And tellingly, Netflix didn't implement it because it was too expensive to do. And I just think the funny thing about like the AGI bro set right now is that they think that capitalism's on their team. And they're going to find that these companies aren't in it for the science, they're in it for the money. And actually, if you follow the money, it kind of completes the loop you guys are talking about. Like, AI is a loss leader for cloud infrastructure. This university, in February last year, succumbed to what many small and medium-sized businesses around the world have come into in the last 5 years, which is big tech reached the plateau of the advertising model. There wasn't a lot of growth left. So they said, where else is there money? Well, all these businesses have a tech line item budget. What if we get them on our infrastructure, our cloud infrastructure? So I now use Microsoft as an employee of this university because I don't have a choice. And once you get the institution on it, it's very hard to get them off. So it's rentier economics. It's like landlords. Software, if you want to understand the future, connect software and landlords, and that'll get you much of what's happening. The loop closing with the fact that like eventually it's not profitable in the way it's been profitable. And that's when I think you'll start to see the quality, if I can say this word here, enshittification, it's been called, which is, I've also been reminded on Twitter, a very white problem because like these platforms have been built for certain audiences and excluded others. The point being though that like we will, I think, start to see degradation in the quality because the economics don't add up. We're in the post-interest-free era. And then I think decomputerization will start to make a lot more sense because it's just not worth the ecological toll, the service isn't as good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm just going to write
But
that
effectively
down.
what that means is that we are currently caught in a big bubble.
Yeah, it's the cloud bubble.
I want to kind of come back to, the question that you were raising around, but what is it that appeals about AI? Like, what is the spreadsheet equivalent that really speaks to people? And I wonder whether this ties to a larger phenomenon around the glorification of productivity also. And that, the technological advances should have made us faster and more efficient than ever before, and yet we're all overworked and we're working more than ever before. We're producing more emails than ever before and more publications and so forth. And burnouts are at a sky-high rate. And there's this real paradox when it comes to this particular bit where we have access to more information than ever before, but no time to actually critically engage with any information properly. I find that I have 18 tabs open at a time to someday read that paper, and often I end up reading the first lines of the introduction and the discussion, and that's it. And so I think it comes in nicely when you feel stressed and you have to continue to produce and excel, and you put something in and go, give me a summary of this article that I cannot read. So I'm curious to also hear what the others think, but I'm curious to see how it might actually change the way we seek out information and make sense of information. I find that for myself at times I actually turn to ChatGPT already instead of Google. I go, just give me a basic recipe for tonight's dinner, and I just go with that. And that's fine for dinner. That's not so fine when I go, did the Holocaust happen? Or what a recent study showed where I think some expert tested some of the 5 biggest LLM models on election-related information. Where's the nearest polling station? By when should I send in my vote? Yeah. And 51% of the time, these 5 top high-performing models hallucinated, gave incorrect, manipulative, harmful responses. And I think that's the bit that's where it's really getting to, that people don't have the time. We're overwhelmed, overstimulated. We can't critically engage with information to make this really important choice when it comes to our democracies. And AI is there to help.
And I think, to me at least, part of the problem around that is, and it comes back to what you were saying, John, in terms of actually, November 2022, when ChatGPT was released, people forget that LLMs were a technology that existed before that, and it's kind of, this was a technology that was looking for a use case, and OpenAI kind of hit upon it by accident and released it to the world, and 100 million people downloaded it in a matter of months, and suddenly the paradigm shifts and all the conversation is about AI. So it's almost, and the interesting thing is we're not yet at the stage of really finding out how we get the square peg in the square hole. We're using it for all sorts of different things and kind of throwing use cases at it that might not be the most suitable for what it's doing, which is essentially pattern matching. But we're all kind of the experiment. It's interesting. I was at an academic conference in Leicester a couple of weeks ago, and one of the people there, I was on a panel, we were the Doomy panel. At the very end of the day, they decided to put us there brilliantly. We were all the people saying, don't do AI stuff, it's scary. And one of the people in the audience, who was a pretty well-respected researcher, said, Yeah, but we find the use of LLMs potentially interesting because we can use them in our experiments in place of human participants in our studies, because they can...
Oh, wow.
Ella's just given a huge intake of breath. I wrote about this for Scientific American as a huge, massive problem. And I explained why this is an issue, because of all the issues, and Jonnie touched upon it. The way that these things are presenting information is very Anglo-centric, very Western, very global North. If you try and find any Catalan language in ChatGPT, large language models like that are trained on the internet's version of the Catalan language, which is anything that's got a .cat domain name. And I don't know, Jonnie spent early years on the internet, probably think the same age as me. .cat domain names often are just cat websites rather than Catalan language. But the thing that this person was saying was, well, we can use this in a way that will mean we don't have to have human participants, and we don't have to, for instance, in a difficult study about maybe asking participants about sexual history or difficult times in their lives, we can instead use kind of facsimiles of them. And I said, but we're essentially actually having a huge issue here. This is, she gave the example of, we would rather do that because in the same way you would rather have a crash test dummy in a car crash rather than a real human being. And my response to her was, have you thought about it the other way? And actually we have hundreds of millions of people currently in the middle of a car crash, and we're the human participants being tested upon here. And that, I think, is my concern about this, is we don't yet know what this is good at, really, and we're kind of just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yes, exactly. I think there's this massive, to use an economic term, I hope correctly, externality here, where the consequences of this tech on the world, we're paying for it. Right? And I went, to come back to the education case study, I went and looked to see what ChatGPT had to say about how we should deal with it in the university. And it basically said, we're going to let the educators figure this out because they know best. And I'm like, okay, okay, but where's the funding? Where's the hiring? Where's the forum? Where's the, it was a 8-question FAQ, and then we'll let the educators figure it out. And I think it's like that with all dimensions of life. And I think that is absolutely unfair. It needs to be priced in or taken away, or
Well, this is what I'm optimistic. There's a moral case to be made for decomputerization. I think I cautiously, tentatively look at the world as we may actually just be in the middle of a transition, because there's not yet, in the way that sustainability and ecology, connected phenomena that people didn't realize were part of the same systemic problem. I think we may just be realizing that digitization historically has followed financialization. So you break up a labor environment and then you can digitize it. You break up a labor environment, then you can turn it into a gig economy. And so if we think about these the people mobilizing these tools, often in service of profit, they're just kind of trying to find markets and build markets around dating or whatever it may be. And I'm cautiously optimistic that people will just say, no thanks. Human curated music, if I'll shout out NTS, is better than Spotify. The algorithm isn't as good as human curation in my experience. And I think we will find that we are living the tech dream right now. How does it feel? And if you had some say in it, I guess I'll end with this, so it's not just it's not a down, it's an up. It's not a prohibition, it's a positive, is that we need social protocols. This, tonight, is a protocol. We've all agreed to come to this somewhat sacred space and talk about important things. That was a choice. There's a famous RAND report, the first kind of military think tank from the 60s, and they say, we have a problem. Technologists tend to be conformists. We can't get any leaders out of them. They're all just doing what they're told. And I think rather than just receive or on the back foot respond to tech, I'm excited about, I think future generations and the young people today are already saying, no thanks. They are doing things that maybe aren't legible in all the right ways, but I think are signaling a turn away from pure exploitation.
I think there is an advantage to being illegible in this.
Yeah, totally.
Because if for those of you who are a bit tech resistant like me, my understanding of how the tech sector understands us is we're laggards. We haven't seen the light yet. We'll get there. We're the future market. We spread out their revenue because we'll adopt later. We're great. So if they think of us like that, they'll never see us coming. So if we are doing all kinds of subversive resistance things and kind of building a movement, we're going to catch them completely off guard.
Well, I don't think it's cool to work at Facebook the way it was when I was 20.
Yeah.
Like, the world is changing, and that's what I'm saying. There may not be a word yet that coheres all this,
Right.
but the evidence is curiously present and in front of us, I think. But I don't know if it's all AI. It may just be that, like, we've got a little drunk on computing.
Saturation point.
Yeah, there's peak computing.
Just going back to that point you started with, which was we're in the middle of something, and it's not quite. I mean, this has happened along many times, because if you look at the human response to big technological changes, that at least in the communications area, what you see is, first of all, a fantastic tendency to overestimate the short-term impact of things, and to completely ignore or underplay the longer-term implications. I mean, if you think of, say SMS. When SMS first appeared, I was an early adopter of mobile phones. I thought it was brain-damaged email, and I had no use for it. Okay, and if you look at the statistics, what you see is that for the early period of mobile phones, you had to be an adult to have a mobile phone because you needed a credit card. And if you look at the use of SMS in that period, it's like the foothills of a very small mountain range. And then there's one moment where it goes whoosh, like that. What was that moment? That moment was when the mobile companies ran out of adults to screw, and they decided that maybe they could have pay-as-you-go phones. And teenagers could have pay-as-you-go phones, and boy, did they know what SMS was for.
But just this year, where they've banned smartphones in schools.
Sure.
So there is sorry, I'm interrupting.
But so that's the first thing about it. But the other thing is that I think there is something weird in the AI thing, in the generative AI stuff now, because, and we had a dry run of that in the 60s when Joe Wiesenbaum came up with the idea of ELIZA, this program that he wrote, which could mimic a Rogerian therapist. And it was just a script. And he wrote it because he was trying to show something about human interface or something like that. But what really disturbed him was that one day, his secretary in MIT asked him to leave the room. Why? Because she was engaging with this robotic chatbot. Okay, and when you watch people engaging with ChatGPT, you're seeing some of that kind of wonder about a machine appearing to talk like a human. And that's one of the reasons why this stuff is, I think, both dangerous and interesting.
If I can offer one more hedge, though, I don't have anything peer-reviewed and published on this, but I personally am I don't know what the word human means. And it's thrown around all the time in the AI space, like, you know, humans. It's like, well, do you mean economic humans? Do you mean, like, psychology's view of a human? Like, I worry about the kind of compression of life experience down to this highly bureaucratized measure of what a human is supposed to be. And I think that humanity I see less often in people that use the word human all the time. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to signal here, is like we've just got highly managerialized, highly bureaucratized. Digital is the forefront of that. But the modern era is not, all it's cracked up to be. And so artists describe post-digitalism. Like, I just think there may be more possibility on the horizon that we forget about if we oversteer to tech landlords. But I don't know. I offer that for consideration.
I think to kind of build on that, it's the oversteer thing is really interesting. We were talking before we came out a little bit about the extent to which this is just the same problems being repeated from previous generations of kind of tech and social media. And I think the concern is we go from kind of doing absolutely nothing to just doing too much and kind of causing issues that way as well. So it is going to be challenging. I don't know if we have answers as to how to actually find a middle way through that is manageable, but still actually meaningful in terms of finding a better use of this technology or finding a better way to kind of coexist. I don't have the answers to that because I translate other people's viewpoints, but
I do think, though, there is a threshold, and I'll stop talking here in a sec, but the people will listen to a podcast on 2x. They don't tend to listen to music on 2x, twice the speed. There are some cultural accelerants that are just not worthwhile, and I think we're going to see that the attempt to kind of optimize the world is like debases the whole idea of optimization, because that's not what makes for life. It used to be that you could tell revolution was coming by the price of bread dropping, and I just think things could get so bleak that future generations are far more political in a historic way that may seem unfamiliar to us today, and that resistance takes the shape it has tended to take, and things change.
But the optimization is no accident either, because most of this technology is built by engineers. I'm an engineer and I can say this, and engineers are obsessed with optimization and efficiency. And what you're seeing, of course, is huge capitalist organizations which are largely run by engineers, and they think that the way to improve life is to optimize it, is to reduce the friction in negotiations or in transactions and so on. It's absolute bullshit. But boy, do they believe it. And the problem is that governments believe it too. So if you take the thing that's wrong with public services is that they're inefficient. Okay, right. Well, here's the most inefficient system we have in a democracy. It's called criminal justice. And it insists on maintaining that people are innocent until they're proved guilty by due process. That's a very inefficient way to do things. Much more efficient is to lock people up on the say-so of the chief of police. We don't do that. Why? Because it's not part of our democratic values, and that's the problem with tech. That it's produced by people who have no conception of democratic values. Actually, I think. And if I were a member of any engineering institution, I'd now be kicked out. But that's the truth, I think.
But I guess that comes back to, doesn't it, I agree 100%, and I think that is a concern. I think that we have frankly, we've lived in 20, 30 years of a world that is seen through an engineer's eyes, and seen through a particular type of engineer's eyes based in a particular part of the world, and actually a particular part of the United States.
Yep.
And that comes with all its kind of myopic viewpoints that are problematic. But what is the alternative? How, to come back to kind of Jonnie's point of how do we find an alternative human, to use that horrible phrase that we can't get a handle on, human viewpoint that matches everything that people need? You're always going to lose out on someone in that framing, and I don't know how you do that. It's sort of consensually.
Okay, here's an answer. We need another panel when it's 7 o'clock. So, thank you for being here.
Can I offer just one piece of optimism on this? Because I was at a meeting with a trade union in the UK, and we were talking about how trade unions should use data, and if they could design smartphones, what would these union members do? And one of them said, I wish we have airplane mode. I wish we had work mode, where I could go home, click a button, and only my friends and family could reach me, and work would not be able to access me until, Monday, because often their days off, they're still answering texts. It's the kind of endless kind of exploitation. And I think there's a whole horizon of decisions, design decisions like this, the kind of, that if we collectively say, yeah, we want that. It's like automobile manufacturers are steering away from screens in cars because people want dials and knobs because screens are dangerous. 50% of the smart devices that are supposed to go online aren't added to the internet. There is evidence to believe we could get over this kind of weird hump in the same way that we don't advertise cigarettes to 14-year-olds anymore.
Okay, I think we should stop. Simply because of the clock. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being here, and I hope it's interesting. And at that,
I think it goes till 7:30.
I thought we had time until... Oh, really?
I think it goes till 7:30. What? Doesn't it go till 7:30?
No.
Oh. I They said it was.
Oh, shit.
Are you sure?
Is there Q&A?
I thought we had a Q&A.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Wait.
Sorry. Fake news, everyone.
That was a test.
Yeah, and I failed it.
There's an AI-generated
Have you
announcement.
got mics? Have you got rubbing mics?
Cool, so we do have Q&A.
Yeah.
If you've got to run, please run, but there's some time to ask questions.
Hi. Oh, it's on. Just to bring it back to the original question of how AI affect democratic processes, I feel like perhaps the panel missed a little bit of the debate today, which is what is the current state of democracy itself?
Yeah.
And a lot of you spoke about distrust and polarization. And there was a little touch on history, but I just wanted to ask, like, what parallels and what lessons can we take from history? You know, technology's always been a threat to democracy. I think of the Luddites, for example. And with AI, you know, if we're saying it's undermining democracy, why then have we seen mass industrial action on an international scale because of the threat of it and the international solidarity that it brings? And so I share somewhat of your optimism. And I think perhaps maybe we should stop having this such patronising politics where we treat people as if they don't know what they're voting for.
Well, there is labor. There is, like, the U.S. labor movement is resurgent. There are acts of or instances that we see positivity. I'll hand to the rest of the panel, but I will just say on the specific question we've been asked, one important thing in my mind that speaks to the kind of what we have addressed tonight around proceduralism is that, like, in the United States, you are entitled by law to a public defender. That public defender may have, 1,500 other cases. So what you have in principle, you suffer a procedural injustice. And I think of increasingly kind of optimizing things risks succumbing to these procedural injustices where, because we try the complex way, it risks kind of not working the way it has in the past. So I would opt, if I was in charge, put to referendum whether voting, there are certain protections. You have the day off. You have these analog affordances that celebrate and make a routine or a kind of ritual out of something that we collectively consider important, so that you feel shame if you don't participate, as opposed to kind of sidelining it or optimizing it. What do you guys think?
So I'm very worried about the state of democracy for many reasons, but one of which I'm going to borrow an argument from Adam Curtis's documentary Hypernormalization, which talked about how Putin's government, the Russian state, and then Trump apparently looked over at the tactics and borrowed them. This idea that if you want to gain control, you just got to confuse and distract the citizenry. So they are just so busy trying to figure out what's going on. This is a kind of fake news argument, that they don't have enough time to, like, really ask questions and debate and decide, right? And I think that's happening right now, but it's almost even worse. Maybe nothing can be worse than that, but no, nothing can be worse than that. But it's equally as bad. But the weird situation is that was a deliberate political tactic. This is like a collateral damage of the pursuit of profit, right? Like, we're all busy figuring this stuff out, and we can't be citizens, and it's, oops, that happened by mistake. That was never our intention. Our intention was to get, customers and make money. So I think I am worried for that, well, many reasons, but that one in particular.
No, I think you've just brilliantly summarized what I would have attempted to say. So.
Really briefly on that, I think it's interesting you talked about the historical context. Obviously, John mentioned earlier the 2016 US presidential election. I know we keep coming back to that, and there's so many other examples. But in some ways, the concerns that some of the people I speak to have is not necessarily about AI alone. It's about AI within a kind of already challenging element. Now, Ella talked about it a lot there in terms of the pursuit of profit. But we have Elon Musk taking over Twitter and firing 80% of the staff, including the election integrity team, including the content moderation team, including the curation team, which means that we lose all of that kind of aspect of the guardrails and the guidelines that we had to try and help us understand some of that very confusing information environment. But then we also have, at the other end, kind of Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and Reels and any other thing that decides to roll out in the next however many months, kind of just completely abdicating the idea of any political oversight there, saying we're not doing politics. this year. And what comes from that is kind of, we talked earlier about kind of like the beneath the radar kind of like rebellious nature, is we might have a kind of worrying element where to avoid that kind of ban on political speech, you see people starting to use doublespeak, or you see people starting to try and do other things. So it's not necessarily about like the wave of AI content that is going to wash over us, but it's also about the fact that it's coming at like right the wrong time for everything else that's happening.
But also, if you go back to the issue of trade unions, I mean, there's been a long history of this, in the sense that if you look at the history of democracy following the shock of the Second World War and the spread of democracies, one of the things that was noticeable about them was the influence and power of trade unions. And one of the, as the prevailing ideology changed from some kind of Keynesian post-war consensus to a more neoliberal one of the projects of neoliberalism is to reduce union power as much as possible, because it reduces bargaining power for wages. But what it means in the end, as unions have eroded, it means that our democracy also erodes, because there's very little countervailing power against the dominant form of corporations. So, and maybe this is just a passing phase, but one of the implications of digital technology was kind of to atomize workers. And the gig economy is no example. It's a neoliberal wet dream, in a way. But yet, actually, trade unions are and were and are really important. And it could be that the resurgence of them would be one of the most helpful things that happened, hopeful things that happened.
Also like Swifties, you know, and young people, you know, like with the war that's going on in the Middle East, the global South calling the global North's kind of ineptitude out and lying out, and young people saying, why is the media reporting it like this when we see, you know, what's actually happening on the ground? Like, I don't know what baseline to compare it to as a historian. I think you're right that we have to keep our standards high, but, you know, overthrowing a king without social media would have been pretty tough back in the day. So I think there's reasons not to be optimistic, but there are reasons to be hopeful.
Another one?
You talked about decomputerization, I think, and this kind of rebelliousness being under the radar, and those are quite indirect things. You know, your analogy about the mass education versus the printing press wasn't direct so people could read the printing press necessarily. So what about more kind of direct, you know, laws or policing or fines and so on from big tech? Have those things already failed? And then what about when it comes to things like elections, where there's maybe an urgent need, where we're uncertain about AI and we urgently need to tackle the effect of AI? Have those things failed, or do you think they're relevant anymore, or is it more an indirect approach to dealing with it in our lives?
Thank you. While you're thinking out, if you go, I think the big question for our time is whether or not liberal democracies can actually control these corporations. Yeah. That's the key question. We know it can be done because it is being done in China. Right? It can be done, but and the only other game in town seems to be the European Union, or at least the European Commission. But when I use that example, somebody pointed out to me that the European Commission is not either a democratic body, it's a technocratic body. But the real question that we're living through now is whether or not liberal democracies, using the processes of the rule of law and the kind of traditions we have about evidence and all the rest of it, whether they can do it. And I think at the moment the jury's out. That's a long-winded way of addressing it. And that's the really worrying thing about this, because if you have unregulated, really powerful institutions, you don't have democracy. You have something else, but it isn't democracy. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess I'd just tag on to that and say, or ask the question, sort of ask you back a question, I suppose, which is the West, I'm sorry, whether these laws and regulations that are incoming reflect an increasing sort of impulse to be more authoritarian by some of these democratic governments and to control how information flows and where it goes. I'm just thinking about some of the research that I did while I was here around WhatsApp and how misinformation spread particularly differently on end-to-end encrypted messaging apps. And for those of you that are not familiar with that, there was basically a big issue in India and Brazil and other parts of the world where misinformation spreading on WhatsApp led to violence and mob lynchings and other things. And so the Indian government, for example, tried to force WhatsApp to break its encryption and tell them who is spreading the misinformation. And what we found in this research is, what WhatsApp did instead was remove the forwarding button and reduce the group size and say that should fix it. And what we found is that, no, it delays the propagation and spread of misinformation. It doesn't stop it, right? And so when you look at Facebook and other platforms, and there's great moderation in place for some of these platforms still, not for X so much, but for others, what we see is, okay, if people can't do it on Facebook anymore, they move on to Signal, they move on to Telegram, and if we don't get to the core of why people believe this and seek out this information and feel strongly enough about it to share it with others and join a Telegram channel or whatever, then we are always just playing catch up with the problem. And so, a long-winded way of saying I don't know, but there's more to it, to that question.
It's a huge challenge, isn't it? Because, Mark Zuckerberg's mantra is move fast and break things, and that's kind of adopted by big tech, and that's fine until you talk about democracy, and then suddenly breaking things and disrupting is a bit of a problem. The challenge is that it requires a completely different way of thinking, and I guess some sort of compromise. John mentioned the China element there of you could either go slow and thorough on this stuff, or you can go fast and a little bit shaky. And different people are trying different approaches. So the European approach is essentially try and rapidly rewrite a set of laws that first implemented in a pre-generative AI world to try and fit generative AI, and there are lots of issues with it. It's been heralded quite well, but I've spoken to lots of people who are really concerned, not about necessarily the electoral bit, but about the kind of impact that it has on human rights and things like that, saying actually it's too draconian. The other issue that we have also is, and I did a story for Wired on this just last week, is there is a huge disparity, and it comes to kind of Johnny's opening thesis of AI companies doing these things for their own benefit and for kind of financial gain, is governments and regulators are bringing toy swords to a gunfight, ultimately. They can only pay paltry sums compared to the compensation that you get if you worked at OpenAI or a Microsoft or anything, frankly. The European Commission was listing jobs to literally analyse the code of these companies when they have to be compelled to do so. And they were paying something like a fifth of what an opening salary is if you just go to Silicon Valley. So, it's a challenge, and it is a concern, and I think we need to have kind of a difficult debate about where we're willing to compromise, where we're willing to maybe put more money, and how important we think it is in order to do so.
I'm actually slightly more optimistic on this, and the reason for it is that the tech supply chain is pretty fragile. Taipei is where most in Taiwan is where most chips are processed. They are traditionally or conventionally one of the wettest places in the world. There were droughts. They had to redivert water from agriculture to chip production. That's going to be a struggle, these kind of battles over water. But I don't know if performing automation is going, climate change is kind of in a kind of hold my beer moment, I think, in saying that delivering on the technological future that we step into as if we all agree on what it's going to look like. I don't think we've factored in climate instability and everything that's going to do to the world. The other thing I'll say very quickly is a theorist named Rob Nixon has an idea of slow violence, that in this culture we tend to think about violent acts if they're kind of quick or bloody or something, and he says we have to think about the slow violence of poverty and of ecological decline and things like that. I think to answer your question about what could decomputerization entail, I think if you look at this again on not just months or years, but decades, I think, and this is maybe the most controversial thing I've said tonight, I feel like intergenerational, I feel like we've been cheated by over generations. Like, I'm tempted to not even have this conversation with people over 35 anymore. Because I feel like I have been put into a laboratory to make a couple of them rich. And I don't want to fix the world on their behalf. I want to fix the world that I've inherited, you know, which is pretty broken. And so I know that young people feel that way, and I think part of what the mental health this moment that we're in, is they're having a rational response to their circumstances. Yeah. It is hopeless. And there's so much performance in this, and I don't know, I think young people do already see through it. And I think it's as simple as like returning to social protocols and passing down wisdom the way that our species has tended to for a long, long time.
But it's also a reflection of the fact that we live in a world which has accepted some things as given. And one of the things that's given is that technology drives this stuff, and society's job is to mop up after it. It's like, you know, the guy who has to walk behind the Indian elephants in the Raj, sweeping up after the elephant. Well, that's supposed to be the society's role as seen by Silicon Valley. And strangely, there's an eerie sense in which this is taken as been the given. We should be saying, instead of saying, how can democracy respond to technological changes? We should be saying, what technological changes would democracy allow? But that's kind of unthinkable in the present climate in which we exist, I think.
So can I just say something about regulation?
Yes.
Which is that I have a huge amount of faith, not unlimited faith. I think regulation can be very problematic, but in regulation in democracies, because I think it is the most potent counterpower that we have right now against big tech. And I think that regulatory change, yes, I would like it to look at us first, treat us first. It's coming. How do you get regulatory change? Hearts and minds. Like, I think we're getting there on that. Mm-hmm. Crisis, we saw COVID, massive amounts of getting it slightly wrong, very wrong, but change. Or new generations. And so I think, you know, the digital literacy problem of Parliament or Congress or whatever, which was laughable 5-10 years ago, is now not a thing. You know, people are getting trained, they're going in, you know, not for the money, but for the kind of civic, you know, duty. I met someone yesterday who's a 20-year-old counselor, and I was like, great, awesome. You know, this idea of, I see it with my students, this political awakening that is, I've seen really sort of, you know, soar ahead in the last 5 or 6 years, is really inspiring. So I do think that we should not, even though we've been talking about sort of secret rebellions, like we should not, we're doing that, we're holding the place for regulation to come in and stop this, right? Like, I think we need to still support our governments in doing that and sort of have faith that they will eventually get there. I hope, I really hope.
Thank you. Okay, two.
Thank you for the great talk. We've heard like a lot of concerns and worries, and you know, they sound pretty serious. I wonder if there's like, do you see any optimism from the like technology point of view, or is it basically the devil incarnate? You know, like why is so much money being put into this? What is like the value? You know, I think a couple of you have said that basically it's kind of useless. It's not really like spreadsheets. It doesn't really help us in doing anything. So what sort of value do you say?
Gosh.
I think, I'll say very briefly, I think there's an aesthetic coming called solar punk, which is the replacement for the sort of cyberpunk, you know, era. And solar punk is premised more on like, I don't know how quickly this will occur, but introducing seasonality, like connecting information technology infrastructure into the dynamics of the earth that, you know, figure in temperature, weather patterns, things like this. And you know, we don't need, for instance, it's quite wasteful right now. There's a lot of gains we can make with things like we don't need access to every photo ever. You could press a button and get it to the next day, you know, if it's going to save the planet. It's not going to, but, you know, like marginal steps like that I think are promising. And I don't know. Just because we're worried about these things doesn't mean there's not lots of fun uses. I mean, people are live streaming this. That's really cool. You can work from home. That's really cool. Video games, some of them are really cool. So I think it's easy to write it all off. I'm channeling my colleague, Dr. Maya Ganesh here, who is constantly like, don't just take the sour, because there's sweet elements too. And that's why I like the notes and rests analogy, because it's like, we need a more pronounced, deliberate, we need more pronounced in-person environments like this, I think, to compensate for their slipping away as we've turned to digital culture. What do you guys think?
Okay. I think there's such a hype machine around big tech and new tech that actually our jobs as, I don't know, critical commentators kind of is to just be critical. I'm not saying there aren't good uses, and I'm not saying that there aren't, like for example, I know, anyway, I won't go into the example, but there are good uses, right? But that's not our job, because the hype cycle is so strong, it's so commercially motivated. It is these technology companies, it's the media that reports on it breathlessly, it's the pundits who are talking about it, it's states who can say, oh, we didn't sort out the elections, but it wasn't our fault, it was, ChatGPT. And I think, I think scholarship's job, and I think scholarship, if you look at kind of the critical technology scholarship, was really hard hitting and probably overstated some of the problems early on, but in my view, that was a political move as a counterweight to the really techno-optimistic stuff we were being fed. Mm-hmm. Research had started to move in a direction of being much more considerate of the pluses and the minuses and users' agency and all of that stuff, which is actually what the world is actually like. But some research is political and it has to fight back. And so that's sort of where I see myself as standing, I guess.
I think you're asking a really important question, and I'm glad that it was asked, because I personally often grapple with whether I can remain an optimistic human and researcher. And so, when we take a step back and think, okay, maybe with AI we can create a society that is more equal, and where education is not so inaccessible, and where I'm thinking of me as a 10-year-old who really struggled with maths. I can go home and I don't have the means to have a tutor, and I can maybe have AI help me figure this one out again and again without judgment. That sounds wonderful. Maybe we can create a society of abundance. We can entertain that as a thought experiment. We're far from it, I think, as a reality. But in the meantime, we are already seeing it being used for really great stuff, for scientific advances, for finding that difficult protein that is missing to cure a disease. In my own research, I think about this a lot. A lot of my work is around, trying to sort of do a pulse check on the zeitgeist in a local context and figure out what are the current misinformation narratives, what are some emergent narratives, and can we get in there before they take reins. And so sometimes I fantasize and go, wouldn't it be great if I had AI on my side? And in the same way that the CDC knows, or that Google knows before the CDC knows that a flu is coming, or an epidemic or a pandemic is coming, could I use, in a shape or form, could I use AI to fight misinformation? Could I build another pre-bunker like myself who picks up on the fact that more and more people are asking these really difficult questions, that more and more people are denying climate and that are asking particular arguments, and I could use that to then, have a more effective way of fighting against it. So I think, of course, we can sit here and be critical about it and name all the ways it could go wrong, but I also think there's huge potential and accelerating potential to use it for good. But for that to happen, the people that are designing it should not just be engineer-minded, optimization-minded individuals, but people who have responsibility and ethics and morals in mind, and the history of it all, and the sociological impact of it all. And I think that is the important bit, that at the moment it's being built by a particular crowd and with a particular data set that is not reflective of all of us and all of our needs.
And I think it's also end users as well. My gran died of lung cancer about a year and a half ago. And one of the ways that AI is being used, particularly computer vision, is to try and pick up those tumours before they become essentially an issue. which would have been great and like fantastic. I think the problem is, because of all the stuff that we talked about in the hype cycle, and I guess the reason why we're warning about this is there is a real risk that you go, this is a brilliant tool, and suddenly doctors clock off and they don't look at it themselves, and perhaps actually sometimes these systems aren't infallible. Either they miss things or they get things wrong. And so I think, you know, there are good reasons to be optimistic. I think it's just that we need to also change our thinking a little bit about what quote-unquote knowledge, which is a really bad thing because we shouldn't anthropomorphize these things, and that's ultimately the original sin of generative AI. But what kind of beliefs we have in these things and their abilities, and also kind of there should be that skepticism because ultimately they might get things wrong as well as getting things right.
When I think about that question, what comes to mind a lot for me is something attributed to Antonio Gramsci, but I think it was somebody else who said it. He said at one point, at a really bleak time in human history, that what we need is pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And I think in relation to this stuff, I would like to change that a bit and say what we need is realism of the intellect and optimism of the will, because pessimism is very disabling and probably unnecessary.
And a global tax on billionaires.
Yeah, that too.
And that.
Like pulling other levers that we have available to us.
Yeah.
We've got time for one more question. If you have to take brief answers, if you can.
Sorry.
Well, my question was more about how we can be practical in our voting, in our awareness, or in our communities about the democratic process as it is becoming now. So how can we, as you said, we're quite easily affected ourselves. How can we, in this moment of potential misinformation, help our communities be more aware?
Have a voting party. Have people over, some of whom you know and some of whom you don't. Like break bread, I would say. It's not going to solve everything, but I think sharing space is a very important ingredient in all of this.
Yeah, I think when you look at social media, much of the political debates appear to exist in almost different parts of the universe. They rarely overlap.
Yeah.
And so there is the infrastructure that we have right now for most of our debate and discourse happens online, but the infrastructure of social media literally drives us further apart from each other. And so I would tag on to that and go, I'm thinking a lot around community and placemaking and how to create really challenging discourse and discussions where I am not necessarily constantly reinforced and further polarized, but challenged on my ideas, and where I have to back up my opinion and attitude towards a policy or a belief, and maybe realize that ultimately, hopefully, that we are more similar than different.
I think two things. One is the first thing you brought up, which was the Kate Middleton story. So I think that whole thing is happening is kind of horrible, but I'm fascinated by one thing of it, which is that it is bringing out to the wider public, probably as relates to your work, kind of the verification tools, tactics, and tips. So people now know how to spot, a bad fake, right? In the general public. Maybe they already did, but now they certainly do. So I think there's something, I think that, one thing that I've seen happen is that people understand just how things might be manipulated and how to figure that out much better, because when I went to school, we were never taught that. But now I think people are learning that in school and beyond. So I think that's one thing. The other thing, I forgot to say this before, but I've tried to start a hashtag today, #TechTimeTax, and I want all of us to use it, which is to tweet at whatever tech company took up all your time today, tell them how much time it took, what you were doing, and what you would have rather been doing. And I think if they start getting to this thing of externalities, if they start getting a sense of all of this crap that they're putting in our lives that probably they're not aware of, just on the collective scale, we can start to sort of push, kind of through market user mechanisms, but push back and say, be accountable for what you've done to our democracies. So.
Okay, thank you. Now, am I right in thinking that we have to stop now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Next time we
Thank
need
you.
an AI.